This week's video is another film stock comparison, only this time I'm evaluating 3 different ISO 100 black and white negative films. Below ISO range films that I would commonly use in my landscape photography. This would be less of a scientific comparison and more of a real-world evaluation of how the films perform on subjects that I would normally photograph in the field. So I'm not going to shoot any optical targets, and I'm not going to look at anything under a microscope. It's just the way that I shoot normally in the field, using smaller, really sharp apertures, shooting mostly nature scenes. The 3 different film stocks I've chosen for this were Kodak TMax 100, Ilford Delta 100, and then doing these comparisons I like to throw an oddball in, something I never tried before, so I threw in Fuji Acros 2. All of these are going to be shot on my Bronica square format 6x6 medium format camera. All the settings will remain exactly the same in between each shot, using my interchangeable backs so that I can switch between the film stocks and shoot the same composition on each film type. So I've come to an area that's up a local canyon that's not too far from my house, I'm really familiar with. And I'm in a little bit of an alcove here that's got some rock textures and trees and a bunch of interesting things. It's also right next to a runoff river that's coming from the meltwater in the mountains, which is kind of nice because it's nice to listen to. It's just a nice area to work. But what I'm working on now is this tree behind me. It's got these sprawling roots, kind of using this foreground interest, reaching out into the frame. I'm using a wide-angle lens, 50mm, and on my square format 6x6, it's kind of equivalent to about a 24 on a 35mm full frame. But I'm using one of these roots in the foreground. It's kind of a lead-in line that leads up to the tree, and then behind it some granite wall. Settings on that were f11, 1/2 of a second. It's overcast right now. There's not a lot of contrast or light in the scene. I focused about 1/3 into the scene on the root itself. The background I'll just capture with depth of field. If it isn't pin sharp, that's okay. I don't have any movements on this camera like I do the large format. So now I'm going to move on and check out these rock walls. They've got some cool textures and stuff on it. It's starting to get rained on here, so I got to hurry up and move the camera before it gets wet. My goal here isn't to shoot, award-winning photographs. This is more just kind of testing the film and seeing what kind of results I get between the 3 different film stocks. So even though this wall is pretty flat and it's all mid-tones, it kind of gives me a good representation of what the contrast characteristics are like on each film. So it's kind of more about trying to choose compositions that are going to help me evaluate specific things that I want to know about the characteristics of the film. With that, I'm going to get to taking more exposures before I get rained on here. And I'm not going to do every single frame to camera like this, but I'll finish the rolls and then I'll see you back in Lightroom to take a look at the scans. So my film is back from the lab, and I've had some time to scan it all in using my Epson Perfection V850 flatbed scanner, which I'll link to down below in case you want to check that out and see what I'm scanning with. But I've scanned them all in as TIFF files and loaded them into a Lightroom catalog. So let's take a look and see what we're working with here. So I have arranged my catalog here with custom sorting so that all the frames line up with each other. So all the frame 1s from each film stock go together, and then all the frame 2s go together, and so on and so forth, so that we're looking at them all in order here. In addition to that, every time I open up this survey view here with all 3 images shown like this, they'll be in the same order. That's how I've set them up. So TMax is always on the left, Delta 100's in the middle, and Acros 2's on the right. That's on the survey view anyway. When we switch over here to compare, you only get 2 images instead of 3. So if you look at the file names I've added in here, this TMax 100, DL 100, you can kind of figure out what's going on there. So this is TMax 100 on the left, Delta 100 on the right, and then Acros 100. That's just so that you can tell at any given time what it is that you're looking at here. And if I go to information here, you can see that these were scanned in at roughly 10,000 by 10,000 pixels square. And these were scanned with Epson Scan 2. I have 3 different scanner softwares that I'm experimenting with. One's being Epson Scan, the other one being Silverfast, and then also ViewScan. I don't know which one's my favorite yet. I've been kind of evaluating all of them. They all seem to have their strengths and different things. But it just so happens with this case, this was Epson Scan, just because I'm more familiar with it. But I also locked my scanner settings down, so the exposure is the same. Epson Scan's got an auto function that kind of tries to set the black and white point for you on each frame. And I've done away with all of that and just used the exact same locked in exposure for every frame on every roll, so that all of the images are scanned in with the same settings, so that they're all consistent. On some of these, you will see some developing settings in here. That's because I did want to tweak the images in so they had something to look at. I wanted to look representative of what I had envisioned in my mind when I took the image. But the important part here is that the auto sync button's on here. So if I turn this off and go to sync, and check everything, hit synchronize, all of these images they have the same slider settings. So what I'm trying to get at here is that I've done the best I can with what I have at my disposal here to try to be as objective as I can, so that what we're seeing here in differences is the difference between the film stocks and not the difference in my development, post-processing settings. With that said, this isn't scientific. I don't have, fancy scientific equipment to try to evaluate these film stocks. So this is just, my experience out in the field using them and trying to be as consistent as I can in between them so I'm not influencing the results. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at some images. You'll notice up at the top here, I got some pretty dark looking frames. We're just gonna forget about those ones and move on, because I'll explain what happened there later. So I'm gonna skip forward a couple frames here. Let's take a look at this one first with the trees in it. I picked this as a subject because I thought that it would be kind of a good representation of what it is that I look for in the field when I'm looking to shoot black and white negative film. I want, contrasty subjects that kind of, exemplify the characteristics of black and white negative film. So of course you don't have color contrast to work with. All you have is tonal contrast. So this is the kind of thing that I would typically use the film for in the field, brighter subjects with a darker background kind of thing, with the aspen trees here. So the first thing that stood out to me is with the TMax looks a little flatter. Delta 100 and Acros 2 looked about similar. If we go into compare view here, the two of those look a lot closer together, look like they kind of perform similarly. To my eyes, it looks like the shadows are just a little bit deeper on the Acros 2 than they are in a Delta 100. So now we're looking at TMax 100 on the left and Delta 100 on the right. TMax looks a little flatter, but it also looks less exposed. It looks like it's slightly underexposed by like, a third to a half a stop. If it was just one frame, then I might just chalk it up to being, lighting changes or something like that. But no, it's a pretty common thread across all of the images on the roll. They all look like they're slightly underexposed. So one of these frames, I have one of these color checker passports. It's like this for color correction. These aren't particularly cheap, but one of the things it does have in it is a super accurate 18% gray chip in it. So on this photo, what I did was I set this scene up under controlled studio lighting and metered off of this card with my light meter, and then just dialed my camera settings in based on that. So just expose it right at middle tone. And as you can see here, the TMax is underexposed from the other two. So this is about as controlled and dead on as I can feasibly get in terms of exposure. So this time it's not changing lighting conditions or anything like that. It just doesn't respond the same at box speed as the other two films. And I've long suspected that this was the case. Shooting TMax out in the field, the stuff that I'd get back from the lab always just didn't look like the exposure was correct. Always looking a little thinner than what I had expected that it would be at box speed. And I don't think it's just the characteristics of the film or like tonal curve or something like that, because if I go look a little closer here and compare this, so TMax on the left, Delta 100 on the right. If I zoom in here, looking at all the tones from the darks to the middle gray chip to the lighter tones, all the way up to the highlights, they're all evenly, like across the board, just a little bit underexposed. So that tells me that it's just not responding to exposure the same as the other ISO 100 films. So what I've done since then, I've been out and I've shot some more black and white negative film and some TMax 100. And I just got some exposures back over the weekend from another trip, which you'll see coming up soon. But what I've started doing is rating the film a little slower than 100, just giving it a little bit extra exposure. So in this case, I've been experimenting with doing ISO 80. And it may even go slower than that, depending on what the subject is. Just because to my eyes, it looks like the film needs that additional, third to half a stop of light. Let's look at another one. And this next one, I like the Acros 2 the most, just because it's the way that it rendered the scene is already kind of the way that I would have done in post-processing. So just a better starting point. In fact, if you look at the settings here, there's no changes on the sliders here. If I hit the reset, nothing happens because this is the raw scan. This is the way it came out of the scanner. It already looks great. But the Acros image has got just a little deeper shadows to my eyes. And it looks like the highlights, particularly down here on like the light tones in this rock, are pumped up just a little bit more. So it looks to my eyes like the Acros has got just a little bit more contrast, which is kind of a cool look. So the one thing I would say is, even though Acros is a little more contrasty and looks great in this image, you really gotta be careful because it's more risky in the sense that it doesn't appear as though Acros has as much dynamic range as Delta 100, which is fine as long as you're dead on with your metering. But if you're off just a little bit, it's not gonna be as forgiving as Delta is. And the difference in contrast here isn't that much, but it's just enough that if you're a little shaky on your metering, it might actually save your bacon. Let's take a look at another one. So some moving water in this one. Like I mentioned in the field, a lot of this was just kind of like, I'm just trying to pick a variety of different subjects that were interesting to shoot and at least something fun to work on. But some of these compositions I was looking for particular things that I wanted to learn about how each film performs, you know, in a certain situation. In this case, I had some bright highlights in the moving water and some really, really dark shadows. So it may not be the best composition in the world, but it was helping me learn what I wanted to learn about the films. Again, TMax looks like it's a little bit darker than the other two. Delta and Acros 2 look really similar, so it's kind of just more of the same here. And if we look a little closer, you got Delta on the left and Acros on the right. If you zoom in here, the highlights look real close, pretty much about the same, but if you look at the shadows, it's really subtle, but it does look like the Acros is a little bit darker. So this is kind of what I was talking about in the last frame. So these shadows went dark enough that there's the potential to lose some information in there. Now my scanner does have the ability to do multiple passes. It'll do like a dark scan and then a bright scan and then try to merge them to get more dynamic range in like a HDR file. So it's possible to pull more detail out of it than what we're seeing here. But I thought it was good to know, at least for me anyway, you know, that you just kind of gotta watch your shadows a little bit on Acros since it doesn't handle it quite as well. It doesn't look like. And then if we look at the TMax image, TMax on the left, Delta on the right, we zoom in here, yeah, it didn't perform as well, but there's no surprises here since TMax appeared to be underexposed to begin with anyway. Moving on, I got this rock face. And this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about, how I was kind of picking compositions that would help me, you know, learn specific things about how the films react. In this case, this rock wall was just all midtones. It was super easy to meter and just point my light meter pretty much anywhere and just take a reading and then put that at middle tone. And what I was hoping to get out of this was just to see how the film stocks would treat and render a scene that is mostly flat like this. In this case, the shadows and the highlights is what I'm really looking at here. And no surprise, I mean, I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but yeah, the TMax just looks underexposed and looks really flat and kind of muddy. But the Delta and the Acros 2 look really similar. If we go compare those, so Delta on the left, Acros on the right, we zoom in here. The Acros is just a little more contrasty. So if you're gonna shoot mostly scenes like this that are already flat, I think the Acros would fit it really well. But the Delta 100 did real close. Just appears to my eyes to be a little more forgiving, I think. Moving on. This one was a subject that's just up a local canyon. I've driven past it several times, but never when I was actively looking for something to shoot in black and white. I thought this was actually a really cool subject. Ended up probably being my favorite photo of this whole series. It's just a classic black and white image, you know, with a bright subject and a dark background. I thought it was really cool. So we got TMax on the left, Delta on the right. We zoom in here. Yeah, some of these shadows are pretty thin. Definitely didn't do so well at box speed. We put Delta on the left, Acros on the right. Again, these two were really close together, but as seen on the other images, the shadows went a little darker. The highlights in the tree here, looks like it's just about pushing the limits of what Acros can do here. So it doesn't handle the dynamic range here between the very, very bright highlights in the dead tree and the very dark shadows quite as well as the Delta did. So there's quite a bit more detail here in the shadows and more on the highlights in the wood grain of the tree. But yeah, super cool subject. Of course, I haven't done anything to these images, so just other than scan them in and get them ready for this video. But of course, I'll crop the borders off and, you know, get rid of this part of the top that's overexposed where the sky poking through. So moving on. This is a pretty classic scenario you find yourself in as a landscape photographer shooting film in particular. You got a nice bright sky and then a super dark foreground. Normally we would fix this with graduated filters. So you knock the sky back a little bit so it evens out the dynamic range a little bit. But in this case, I did not do that because I wanted to see what happened when you shot it without filters to see how the film would handle the scenes. And not too bad. TMax, you know, of course, started out from kind of a disadvantage. So if you look at the shadows here, it's pretty lacking in detail. And then comparing Delta to Acros, Acros didn't do so well in the shadows here either. Delta 100 definitely got a little more detail there. If you look at the brighter parts of the sky, so this was kind of a cloudy, overcast day where you got kind of white skies. But there is some detail in here, so if I go in here and turn the sync on, drop my highlights. So there is still information on those clouds that you can pull out, so you can still get the detail back out of it. And all three of the film stocks recovered okay. It'd be fine. Of course, this isn't ideal exposure, you know. The ideal exposure is you would use a grad filter so that you don't have to do these kind of recovery moves in post. But if you didn't have grad filters or you miscalculated your exposure, you'd stand a better chance with probably the Delta 100 on this image. So moving on to the next one. This is a zoomed in kind of shot on the side of a big rock face with a bunch of evergreen trees around it. It's a little abstract. And again, there's really no surprises here. TMax looks the darkest. Delta and Acros is pretty close. On this one, I actually preferred the Acros 2. Just because there was enough exposure here, I wasn't really worried about loss of shadow detail. There's plenty of detail in the shadows here. It is more contrasty. It looks like it's in a good spot. Both images look sharp. I would certainly take either of them as a starting point. I think they're both fantastic. I didn't catch while I was framing it that I had a little bit of sky poking out here on the top. And of course, the Acros didn't handle the highlights. It blew out a little bit more than the Delta did. Not by much, but just a little bit. So if we go all the way back to the beginning of these frames here and take a look at some of these ones. So what had happened is my Bronica EC 6x6 medium format camera that I shot all these with. I'm not super familiar with that camera just yet. I'm getting a little better with it, but I've got this weird thing where I keep turning the shutter speed knob the wrong direction. I don't know why. And that's what happened here. So I had dialed in an exposure for a normal exposure, but then decided to go ahead and throw a linear polarizer on. And I knew how much I needed to correct and how much the linear polarizer took away. So I had to add additional time for that. And when I went to add the adjustment to my shutter speed, I turned it the wrong direction. So it actually took away a stop-a-light instead of adding it. So it ended up underexposed. It's weird. I don't know why I do that and just need to pay more attention. But that's what happened with the first couple of exposures. So this one was a linear polarizer that I was trying to use to try to get more punch and detail all these clouds that were coming up over the ridgeline. I actually ended up getting a rain shower after this one. So there was a storm building in. It was super cool looking. I just thought I'd try to get more drama and interest out of the sky, and then accidentally compensated in the wrong direction with the polarizer. But I left them in anyway because we can still learn something out of this. In this case, gross underexposure. How does each film stock handle being grossly underexposed? And you can see I've added almost 2 stops to recover some detail out of these images, which is about right because my linear polarizer takes about a stop of light away. Since I went the wrong direction, it would have left me 2 stops underexposed. So it all works out. But looking closer, TMax on the left, Delta 100 on the right. So yeah, no surprises here. It didn't hold detail in the shadows quite as well as the Delta did. And if we compare that Delta with Acros, kind of the same thing. A little big old scratch in my Delta image there. So this is kind of what I was talking about. The Acros has got great contrast, but it's just not quite as forgiving if you make a mistake. Now in the next couple images as you go, it gets progressively worse. And that's because on this one I used a red 25 filter. So as you can see, I got the highlights in these clouds here, but I was trying to use the red filter to push the blues darker in the sky. And that red filter takes 2 stops of light away. So when I adjusted it the wrong direction, I ended up being 4 stops underexposed. So the end result here is, yeah, none of these are usable. These are all unrecoverable. And keep in mind, we're looking at this correct and inverted, but this is black and white negative film. So the lights are dark, the darks are light on the film stock itself. And it's transparency film. So all these dark areas that we're seeing here that don't have any detail, the film negative itself is almost clear. It's completely transparent there. So you can scan this all day long and you're not going to pull much detail out of a clear piece of film. So not that I would likely try to use an image that was 4 stops underexposed. I think I would just go reshoot it. But it just goes to illustrate and drive home even further that, you know, something like Acros is just, you don't want to make a mistake like this because it's not going to recover well. And then the last of the really dark images, This was a red 25 filter with a landscape polarizer. So I needed to compensate 3 stops. And because I went the wrong way, this is 6 stops underexposed. And yeah, there's nothing there. None of these films are going to perform well if you're going to make that big of a mistake. So don't do that. And then the very last frame, just for funsies, I thought I'd try a bathroom selfie. So here's my attempt at that. Nothing new here that we haven't already discovered and discussed on the other images. But kind of interesting, I thought, was the way that Acros handled the highlights and the skin tones. Again, you'd have to be careful here, make sure these highlights don't go too hot, but I kind of like the way that it handled the skin tones. So I think if I was going to shoot portraits on black and white negative, I might actually give Acros a shot because I like the way that that rendered, but Delta would be a perfectly good pick too. And then of course the TMax image just happened to be the goofiest face, so I thought it'd be funny to do a different goofy face on each frame. I'm not going for a Match.com profile image here anyway. It was certainly kind of a fun challenge to try to figure out how to focus on some sort of fixed object in the mirror and then try to move your face in plane so that it stays in focus without moving too much. That was kind of an interesting challenge. I think I did all right. Some images might be sharper than others, but it was fun to do anyway. So that was all 12 frames on these rolls. I think the key takeaway for me here was the whole TMax thing, realizing that I need to give it a little more exposure in order to get it to perform the same as the other ISO 100 films. But all things considered, after having some time to review all these images and go through all these, I think it was actually Delta 100 that ended up standing out to me. So I think moving forward, that's going to be the film stock that I choose most of the time when I'm doing my landscape images, at least for the time being. It's also a little cheaper, a little more economical than the other 2 films. Acros 2, I don't think is available in sheet film sizes anymore. And if you're familiar with my channel, you know that I shoot a large format 4x5 camera quite frequently. And Delta 100 is available in 4x5 sheet sizes. So I think that's the direction I'm going, which was kind of the purpose of running this test, is I kind of wanted to see if I wanted to go that direction or if I wanted to stick with TMax. So I think that's been answered for me here. So I hope this was informative for you in some way too, or at least entertaining anyway. And let me know down in the comments if there's other films in particular that you'd like to see compared to one another. If this video does well enough and if there's enough requests, then maybe I'll see if I can throw those in the mix. I think it might be interesting to see if any of these results carry over to the ISO 400 films. Like TMax 400 might perform perfectly at box speed, for example, as opposed to the TMax 100. So maybe I could try to do TMax 400 versus HP5 and one other film of some sort. But that's gonna be it for me on this one. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you can let me know by hitting that thumbs up button down below. And maybe if you want to see more videos from me, consider hitting that subscribe button while you're down there. I also wanted to let you know that I've launched a Patreon page. Super shout out to Paul, who's my first patron ever. And if you want to put your name on that list and throw in your support and help me make more videos like this one, there'll be a link down in the description box below where you can check that out if you'd like to. I can't thank you enough for telling you how much I appreciate all the support. It really does mean a lot to me. But that's it for now. Take care of yourself, and I'll catch you in the next video.